not. The Bible talks about fear not. The way through it. It's actually one of the most common phrases that God speaks to us himself. This isn't like through third person. This is God talking to us, and he says, fear not constantly. When it comes to fear, all of us struggle with it. All of us deal with it. This is what I believe. I believe that love is the core emotion for all good emotions that we have. I also believe that fear is the core emotion to every negative emotion that we have. And when we talk about fear, there's a couple of different kinds of fear. When we talk about fear, and I know a lot of people, they're like, no, I'm not afraid. But the truth of it is, we're afraid of more things than we realize. Some of it is warranted, and some of it's not. Like, I have some fears. I have some phobias, snakes being one of them. I hate snakes, but it's warranted. I have a good reason. I was in Fort Benning, Georgia in 1993, and we were doing what's called 3 to 5 second rushes. And you stand up and you run, you dive behind a tree, and you shoot your gun. And I was doing that, and I was right in the middle of the exercise, and I jumped up, and I ran, and I dove behind a tree, and I was laying down, and a sledgehammer hit me right in the thigh. And I wasn't really sure what it was, but it hurt a lot. And when I stood up, there was a baby rattlesnake hanging off my leg. And they had to dunk me in a bath of ice water. And they had to medevac me out. Ever since then, I have been on a mission to kill every snake God created. It's a revenge factor. I get it. I took a picture once. I'd killed a big old rat snake. I took a picture, posted it on Facebook. And everybody's like, oh, you shouldn't hurt the poor innocent snake. I'm like, there is no innocent snake. They're all related. Another fear that's warranted is in that same snake. I was outside like cutting grass, and I picked it up, and my, at that point, probably 7 or 8 year old son rounded the corner, and what meant to be throw it out in the woods slipped out of my hands and went right in his direction. He yelled, jumped about that high off the ground, and by the time I could catch him before he got to his mom, he had sprinted and was absolutely terrified, hugging his mother's leg. And I got the snake eyes from Mom as I walked in, and I was super apologetic. But he's now scared of snakes because of me. Again, why I don't teach on parenting. I'm just telling you, some of y'all are saving up for college. I'm saving up for therapy for my kids. Some fears are warranted. Some fears are not. I'm petrified of heights. And it sounds absolutely insane because I was with the 101st Airborne, and you had to jump out of helicopters and rappel off of towers and all of that. But I've been scared of heights for no reason whatsoever other than I'm just afraid. I've never fallen off of anything. Like my parents, we went up the Appalachian Mountain, the Blue Ridge Parkway. Like we were, there's that extreme drop off. I sat on the far left side of the car, huddled up, petrified. I have frozen up driving a van full of girls when we were at Steel Creek going up a volcano. I froze up, middle of the drive, going through the Aransas. I hate heights. I cannot stand them. Cassie and I got married early on, and we were going to go on our honeymoon. And it was the first time we had flown together. And I was sitting there, and I'm like, oh, my gosh, I'm gripping her leg. I'm breaking out in sweats. I'm like, we're going to die. And she said, this is Expedia. We haven't even bought the tickets yet. That's how afraid of flying I am. I will drive 10, 15 hours before I get a plane ticket. But there's no reason. There's no reason. Nothing's ever happened. For some of you, you have fears. We all have things that we're afraid of. I was looking at a study by Chapman University. It's a college out in California, and they did a survey on the fears in America of what were the biggest ones. 25% of people said they were scared of public speaking. I get it. You say something wrong, you look foolish. For me, I would think that would be public singing. That is the most, that's the most I can imagine of putting yourself out there in front of people. The second was heights. See, I'm in good company. The third was some type of animal, whether it be snakes, spiders, sharks, which I get. Anybody watch Jaws? Yeah. We've got claustrophobia, we've got needles, we've got strangers, we've got darkness, zombies, and clowns. That rounds out the top 10. How many of y'all still walk around drainage ditches? Y'all watched it, didn't you? I get it. Clowns are awful. Those are all real fears. But as a congregation, let's take a look and go a little bit further than that, because we all have things that we say that we're afraid of. But what about fear of failure? When you start talking about deep, intimate fears, and you start talking about fear of failure, I'm telling you, there's not a guy in here who's a dad or a husband that hasn't worried about failure, that hasn't worried about, I need to get a job, I need to provide for my family, I've got to worry about all of those, and it can oftentimes turn into fear. Fear of failure is a big one for some of you who've stepped out in your own business. How much fear is behind that? If I don't make the sales, if I don't make the contracts, then my business is going to fail, and then what am I going to do? Fear, negative emotion that causes all negative emotions, anxiety, depression. Fear is the root cause of all negative emotions. What about fear of rejection? Fear of rejection. There's a lot of people that won't put themselves out there because you're afraid somebody's going to tell you no. You're afraid that you're not going to measure up. You're afraid that you're not going to be good enough. This is why some of you haven't dived into a word group yet, or you haven't dived into a Sunday morning group because they're feared that, groups are filled with really weird people. But you're afraid in the back of your mind that if you step out and you go to a group that for some reason they're not going to accept you, that they're going to reject you. Some of you have trouble with intimacy in relationships. You have problems going into a relationship because you're so afraid of rejection. It's the fear of rejection. It is a core fear, often for good reasons. Maybe you got rejected in a workplace. Maybe you got rejected in a relationship. But for us, the fear of rejection is a huge one. It's huge. The fear of death. Some of us have a fear of death. We have a fear of the afterlife, even though God says do not fear. I'll be honest with you, I never thought I had a fear of death until I was strapped to a table battling cancer. I was scared to death of dying. And for no reason. I've accepted Christ. I know that my eternity is sealed, but a fear was running through my mind. Who's going to raise my kids? Who's going to take care of my wife? Who's going to do this? It was fear. And that fear actually led to massive, massive anxiety that I battle, even still today. Fear of the unknown. What about that? Some of you are afraid of tomorrow. Some of you are afraid of big moves, big direction changes, career changes. You'll stay in a career your entire life because you're afraid of the unknown. These are just some of the topics that we're going to broach over the next 5 weeks. There's so much crazy going on in the world today that we constantly live in fear. And it's driven, media driven, commercial driven, news driven. It is driven to be fearful. When you look at the wars and the rumors of wars and the economy and the presidents and the leaders and what's Turkey or North Korea and nuclear, all of this, if you listen to the news long enough, you can walk out of that with a real fear. And I believe that fear is the most profitable marketing strategy of news media today. I really do. Nobody ever turns on the news and somebody goes, hey, today's going to be a good day. Everything's probably going to work out for you. We've got nothing going on in the world, and I bet you keep your job and make a lot of money. Nobody ever does that. But what they do is they talk about all the things that are going wrong, all the things that can go wrong. And even subconsciously in the back of our mind, it creates a level of fear. We fear for our children's future. I've said this before, and I shouldn't say it. I shouldn't walk in fear, but you look at culture today, and it worries me. What's that going to look like 5, 10, 15 years from now? We fear for our families. We fear, you watch school shootings, and you watch, and that's real. But it's fear. You drop your kids. You can live in a state of fear based off of current events. We fear oftentimes for our financial future. We fear for our safety, and the list goes on and on and on. So today I wanted to take a look at it. I called today's message the negative effects of fear. We're going to kind of do an overview today, and then as the next 4 weeks go through, we'll dive into each one of those topics that I just talked about. But today we're going to kind of give an overview of fear and the negative effects of fear. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but we live a life where we are so afraid. The most popular phrase all throughout the Bible is in some context, do not be afraid, or Fear not is actually listed within the context of real fear about 110 times. And here's the truth. If God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, who has? The enemy. The enemy gives us a spirit of fear. The enemy gets in our head, gets in our thoughts, gets in our heart, and he gives us a spirit of fear to lock us down, to make us ineffective, to keep us from moving forward in life. But yet, if we would just soak up the Word of God, if we would just soak up Scripture, one of the things that God talks about all throughout directly to us is fear not. Do not fear. And if we can get to the point where we just put these on our mirrors, that we put them on our dashboard, that we put them on our desk throughout work, one of the things that we'll realize is that if God says do not fear, we shouldn't fear. Here's the truth of it. When it comes to anxiety, when it comes to fear, did you realize that 95% of things that we're anxious about never actually come to pass? 95% of things that we get so worked up about actually never come to pass. When we look throughout the Bible at the different areas that God said, do not fear, we look, it starts all the way in the beginning of Genesis. It's when Abraham, he said, do not be afraid because you haven't had the child that I promised you. Hey, moms out there that haven't had that baby that you're so looking forward to, don't worry, don't fear. God has a plan. Exodus 14, they talk about, do not be afraid of the Egyptian army, for I will bring you out of slavery. I'll bring you out of bondage, to the point where he even parted the Red Sea so that they could be saved. In Joshua, we see, do not be afraid to take the land that I have promised. I have promised. Don't look at all the negatives. Don't be afraid to walk into my promise. Listen to me. See what I've done for you in the past and move forward in the promises of the future. Matthew 1, God directly sends an angel and he tells Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary. First off, if I wake up and there's an angel sitting in my room, I'm going to be afraid of that. But God said, do not be afraid. When the ladies came into the tomb, there was an angel sitting on the rock after Jesus' resurrection. Do not be afraid. Over and over and over. We even find in Acts, God tells Paul, do not be afraid to preach the gospel. Go in the power that I give you, and I will protect you. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Fear not. So why do we fear? In the context of being afraid, 110 times, God says, do not be afraid. But yet, over and over and over in our lives, we continue to walk in some state of fear, to the point where it affects everything around us. It affects our relationships. It affects our workplaces. It affects our family. Today we're going to look at a story that gives a great overview of what fear can do, not just to a person, but to a group of people. If you've got your Bibles, turn with me. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. If you're not familiar with the Bible, start at the beginning, go about 4 books to the right. That's where we're going to be. If you don't have your Bible this morning, we're going to be up here on the screen. The New Living Translation, for me, is just easier to understand. If you don't have a Bible, there's a free app. It's called the YouVersion. I use it all the time. It's got great devotions. It's got every translation you could possibly have. So, but we're going to be there in Numbers 13 and 14. And we're going to look at some things that fear does to us individually and as a group. It starts out after exploring the land for 40 days. A little backstory on this. The Israelites had been taken out of bondage. They had been taken out of slavery. They had crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptian army had been destroyed, and they were in the wilderness. They were getting ready to go into the land that God had promised them. They were kind of at the foothills of that land that God had promised. And this is where the story goes. Moses had sent out some spies to check out the land and make sure it was inhabitable and to make sure that it was good enough for them to go into. And it says after exploring the land for 40 days, spies, there were 12 of them. The men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at the Kadesh in the wilderness of the Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen, and they showed them the fruit that they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. And they talk about in this story that they actually had brought grapes back that 2 men had to carry on poles because it was so bountiful. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there. The descendants of the Anak, the Amalekites, live in the Negev, and the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the fearful Cellulites. No, I'm just kidding. Just seeing if y'all are paying attention. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. Then it goes on and says, but Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. You see, when we live in fear, so these guys go out and they're looking at the land. They see all of the good things. They see the fruit. They see the milk and the honey. And they said it's a land that is perfect. God's promise is perfect. It's everything we've heard about. It's everything that we've dreamed about. But here's what fear does. Because even though they saw all of the good, they saw the giants. They saw the things that were going to be obstacles. When we live in fear, when we have fear, when we walk in fear, fear leads to a defeated mindset. Fear leads to a defeated mindset. 2 men came back with a report that, man, let's go take it. Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it, but the other men who had explored disagree. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. 2 men went up and they saw the amazing promise of God. They saw what God had promised, and they were ready to walk forward in confidence and in faith. But 10 men said that we can't do it. 10 men said that we can't take the land. I want to tell you something. In this story alone, there's 2 groups of people. There are the we cans, and there are the we can'ts. The we cans and the we can'ts. You see, it even looks like it over 2,000 years later in this room this morning. I can divide this room up into a couple of different groups. The we cans and the we can'ts. We can make our marriage work. Through thick or thin, we're going to stick with it. Or the we can'ts. This is never going to work out. You know what? We've got too much baggage. It's too hard. This is never going to work out. Or how about, I can forgive and move on. I can forgive that person. I can walk and not live in bitterness. Or the we can'ts. You have no idea what they did for me. I can never forgive them. I can never move forward. I can never get past my past. It's too big. It's too bad. It's too awful. They did this to me, and I'm going to live. I can't forgive. I can change careers. I can walk in the purpose that God gave me. I can be a light in a dark world in my work. I can be in a mission field no matter where I'm at. Or I can't. I'm going to stay in the same dead-end job, find no purpose, no life. I'm just going to walk around miserable because I'm not good enough or I'm not smart. You see, even today we live in I can and we live in I can't. You see these people from a mile away. There's the I cans. And there's the I can'ts. The story goes on and it says, so they spread this bad report land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All of the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. You see, the difference between we can and we can't is all about perspective. When you talk about the I cans and you talk about the I can'ts, the difference of it, perspective. It's not what you see, it's how you see it. You had 12 men go into a land together. You had 12 men see the same thing together. They saw the fortified cities. They saw the big people. They saw the milk and honey. They all saw the same thing, but they came back with different perspectives. It wasn't that they saw something different. It's that they saw it differently. It's all about perspective. When you live in an I can't or an I can world, it's all about perspective. When you talk about fear, it's all about perspective. Perspective plays such a huge part in how we view the world. Perspective plays a huge part in how we view our relationship. Perspective plays a huge part in our parenting abilities and our parenting confidence. You see, I can has a perspective of I can do it. I can move forward. I believe in God's promise. I can't has the perspective of it's too bad, it's too big, it's too powerful. How you look at different things in your life will be the determining factor on how you proceed, how you look at your relationships, how you look at your parenting, how you look at your career, how you look at your school students. How you look at it will be the determining factor in how you proceed. Looking through the lens of fear is I can't. Looking through the lens of faith is I can. The I can's faith, the I can't's fear. Too hard, too long, always. Are you seeing your life? Are you seeing your problems? Are you seeing your relationships through I can faith? Or are you seeing your life and your career and your relationship through I can't fear? You see, I can faith is the belief in a sovereign God. I can faith is a belief in a sovereign God. And if you're taking notes, you need to write that one down. Because here's the truth of it. To walk in faith, you say that I believe that God is sovereign. I believe that God is in control. You see, I hear all the fear about the presidents. About every November, I hear this fear. Oh, my goodness, we're going to have this one. Or, oh, my goodness, we're going to have that. The truth is, God has our nation in the palm of his hand. And if you believe in a sovereign God, you believe that he is in control. When it comes to your kids, it's such a scary place to be. I'm afraid that I'm not raising them right. I'm afraid that they're not going to turn out right. I'm afraid that they're not going to get that scholarship. I'm afraid that I'm going to mess up as a parent. But if you believe in a sovereign God, you stand on the promise of raise a child in the way they will go. And when they get old, they will come back. You see, I can says, I believe that there's a God bigger than me. I can't says, I don't believe my God's big enough. When you look at it through that lens, especially in a room like this, it kind of takes you back because you're like, well, I believe in a sovereign God. Then why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? If you believe that God has your children in the palm of his hand, if you believe that God has your marriage in the palm of his hand, if you believe that God has your career in the palm of your hand, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? I can, faith in a sovereign God. I can't, your God's not very big. You see, when we look at it in that lens, it changes the perspective. Are you seeing your life through the lens of faith? Are you seeing your life through the lens of fear? Are you seeing the storm that you're in through the eyes of faith? Or are you seeing the storm that you're in through the eyes of fear? And here's a good way to tell. When you walk in fear, you live in anxiety. When you walk in fear, you live in depression. When you walk in fear, you live in anger. You live in criticism. You live in negativity. But when you walk in faith, you walk around without a care in the world, kind of. Fear's always going to creep in a little bit. But when you walk in faith of a sovereign God, you can sleep at night. God's got this. God's going to supply all my needs according to his riches and glory. God will never leave or forsake me. Greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. God's got this. God's got the economy. Even in 2008, God's got the economy. God ordains leaders. God's got this. I can says, I have a sovereign God. I can't says, my God is so small. Or I don't trust the God that I serve. Perspective is the key to an I can life or an I can't life. Perspective is key to faith-filled life or fear-filled life. How are you viewing your life? Story picks up. So they spread the bad report among the land and among the Israelites. You see, fear gives us a poor self-image because as it goes on, it talks about all the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants, descendants of Anak. And then it says this. It says, next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. We felt like grasshoppers. Of all the animals in the world to compare yourself to, a grasshopper might be the least of these. They've got no real purpose that I know of. I know I'm going to get an email from a science person. You're going to lay out all the reasons God created grasshoppers. I get it. I'm not dogging the grasshopper. I love them. I'm glad Noah put them on the boat. Seriously. Grasshoppers. Look at them. What do? They hop around. They get eaten. They're somebody's food. Some of y'all chocolate-covered grasshoppers. But they serve Like, what do? They are the least of them. You can stomp on them. You can squash them. Frogs eat them. These guys go into the land and they come back and their report is, hey, we're like grasshoppers. They have a low self-image of themselves. They have a low self-image of their God. Because think about this for a second, right? So this is a group of people that got rescued out of slavery. They're going across the desert. They got the pharaohs coming with the chariots and the big swords and the big army, and they're coming to kill them. And God parts the sea, and they walk across on dry land of a big sea, and then God causes the waves to crash. He kills the whole army, and he saves them. And these guys are still, yeah, I don't know if we can do it. We're like grasshoppers, and they're giants. They're so big, they're so powerful, they're so fortified. This series, I want us, I know today's an overview, but this series, I want us to shift our perspective, not just of our situation, but to shift our perspective of ourselves and go from I can't people to I can people. You see, even the perspective of our own lives, when we walk in fear, we have a low self-esteem. We have a low view of ourselves, and we have a low view of God. This series, I want us to shift mindset from the mentality of fear to a mentality of faith. I want us to shift our mindset when we're looking at our situations, even if you're in here today and you're in the worst storm that you're in. Can I tell you something? If you view it through the fact that God's never left or forsake you, and you look back, the fact that you're sitting in here today means you've made it through every storm that you've gone through. The truth is, God didn't leave you then. He's not going to leave you now. So why are you afraid of the storm? Walk in faith. It's all about perception. It's all about viewing it through an I can attitude. And here's the deal. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes you have to look backwards to see that God never left or forsake you. Think about it. At your worst time, think about it. Think about that for just a second. Did God bring you out of it? He did. You're sitting in here today. You're not in a cemetery. He brought you out of it. And if you're in a storm today, He's going to bring you out of the next one and the next one. God never promised us not to have storms. See, that's a misconception. That's that gold dust going to fall from the sky, pie in the sky stuff that we do a bad sales pitch with. The truth is, when you step out in favor and you step out in faith and you step out following Christ, the enemy's going to come at you with everything he's got. And all throughout Scripture, we see storm after storm from Job to Peter. And God never said we weren't going to have storms, but He said, hey, if you'll keep your eyes on me, if you'll focus on me, I will never leave or forsake you. I can take the land. I don't care about the big buildings. I don't care about the giants. What is the giant in your situation that you're afraid of? God said, I promised it. I'll deliver. Today it looks like this. I can change. I can be successful. I can run that department. I can have a successful business. I can graduate. I can step out. I can join a group and step out of my comfort zone. I can begin serving in a way. I can be the leader God called me to be. I can be the spiritual leader of my home, dads. I can be that guy. I can be the spiritual leader of my family. I can be the spiritual leader of my workplace. I can mentality is faith-filled mentality. I can't mentality is fear-filled mentality. I can take the land. I can change. I can break this addiction. I can. I can because I am a child of the Most High God. I can because I am beautifully and wonderfully made. I can because God promised to provide. I can because His Word says that He will. And if He will, I can. Bottom line, if He will, I can. We may not always get the answers we want, but the promises of God says, I will never leave you in the storm. I will provide all of your needs. He doesn't say I'll provide all of your bass boats, all of your hunting equipment, all of your football wins for Alabama. He doesn't say that. You notice I didn't say Auburn. I think y'all root for the other side. But the truth is, God says, I will supply all of your needs. So why fear? He says, fear not, for I am God. I'm not a grasshopper. I'm a lion. You see, when you look at fear and you look at grasshoppers, and then you look at what God calls us to be, He calls us to be lions from the tribe of Judah. Wow. Lion. Grasshopper. Which one do you want to be? Which one are you being? How are you living? Are you living through the eyes of a grasshopper? Or are you living through the eyes of a lion? greater is He who is in me than he that is in the world. Fear also leads to over-exaggerating situations. Y'all, somebody who's afraid, oh my gosh, is never going to happen. Never. They all hate me. Everybody's smarter than me. I'm never going to get that promotion. Nobody likes me. Nobody listens to me. You see, these guys go in and they come back and they're like, we look like grasshoppers, and they think so too. Here's what's funny about that statement. These guys were spies. The enemies never saw them. But now between they were giants, they've now projected that the people who were in the land think that they're grasshoppers too. People in the land never saw them. Never talked to them. Don't know anything about them. And they're like, oh, they're so much stronger. How do they know they're stronger? They didn't see their armies. They saw their cities. They saw a lot of it. But see, when they came back, they started exaggerating. We'll never take the land. I'm never going to be able to stop that addiction. I'm never going to be able to get that promotion. I'm never going to be able to raise my kids correctly. Fear versus faith. Fear versus faith. All the people think this way. No, they don't. Everybody will believe them. Everybody's better than I am. I can't do it. I have no talent. It's always been done like this. You see, when we live a fear-filled life, we exaggerate the situations. And here's probably the most dangerous part of living a fear-filled life, is we actually can contaminate others. We can contaminate others. You see, when these guys came back, the story goes on and says, then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried out. Voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If we died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness. You see, fear contaminates joy, and it robs of us. Fear robs us of our, and it contaminates others. Check this out. They were in slavery, bondage. They were beaten. Their kids were taken. They lived a horrible life. But yet in a moment of fear, oh, if we had only died in Egypt. Oh, if we had only could go back to Egypt. You see, when we start walking around in fear-based life, what we're saying, we often forget where God's brought us from, and we focus on the situation that we're in, and then we exaggerate it, and then our exaggerations go to other people, and it doesn't just contaminate the group around us, but it contaminates our joy. We lose our joy. You walk around in fear. You walk around in anxiety. You walk around in criticism. You walk around in anger. Fear is the root cause of every negative emotion. And it contaminates others. And here's the thing about fear, and you see it. You'll see it in the workplace. You'll see it on campus. You'll see it in the schools. Sadly, you'll see it in churches. When people live in fear, what they see, nobody likes to be around negative people. Nobody can be around negativity for very long without becoming negative. So what people with fear do is they often huddle around other people who are fearful. What fear does is it says, I'm afraid, I need people around me that are afraid. Fear is a cancer. Fear can begin as one cell, and it can turn into a group of cells, and it can contaminate not just a church, not just a school, not just an environment, not just a workplace, but it can actually contaminate all of those around you to the point where it can cause death. It can cause immobilization. We get so scared, we can't even move forward. We can't even walk out of the house. We're scared to go to our job. We're scared to let our kids off at school. We're scared. And it contaminates others. It contaminates others. Fear had an entire nation ready to stone these two men. It had an entire nation ready to stone these two men. These two came back and they were walking in the promise of God. These two came back and they did what God instructed. These two came back and they saw the faith of God. But yet an entire nation, because of 10 men, decided, you know what? We're better off in Egypt and we want you dead. It contaminated everybody. You see, fear is a miserable place to live. And one of the reasons I know this is I've lived there. Look, I know in seminary they teach you that you shouldn't have problems and you should project that you don't have problems. I'm going to tell you something. I battle anxiety. There's times that I battle depression. There's times that I walk up afraid of all kind of things. But God says, I didn't give you a spirit of fear. I didn't give you a spirit of being timid. He said, I will be with you. If fear is the disease, if fear is the root cause of all negative emotions, what happens when we live in a life of fear and not faith? What does that look like? The first thing it does, it makes us stop making progress. Fear keeps us from moving forward in our calling. Fear keeps us from moving forward in our relationship. Fear keeps us from moving forward in the parents that we were called to be. Fear keeps you from being the spiritual head of your house. Fear keeps you from moving forward with Christ, because you know what? Maybe I don't know all the verses. Maybe I don't know what 2 Corinthians is. See, everybody wanted to blast him for saying that. Maybe he doesn't know what it is. Maybe I don't know John 3:16. Maybe I don't know the Lord's Prayer. Maybe I don't know the songs. You say turn to Numbers, I don't even know where that is. So you know what? I'm afraid. People are going to look at me funny, so I'm not going to step into a church. I'm not going to move forward with that because I don't want to look like a fool. I'm afraid. I run my kids all over town. I run my kids all over the city. I run my kid to every camp because I'm afraid that he's not going to make it. If I don't, God won't. Fear. Fear stops us from making progress. These guys, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. We're going to get rid of our leader because we're afraid, and it had to be better, right? Because somebody fed us and somebody... At least there we knew. Here, we might die. They're so much stronger. They're so much bigger. You told us God would provide, but look at all the obstacles. Look at all the giants. It kept them from moving forward. It's so dangerous. Fear has an entire nation ready to go backwards, not forward. See, God promised them. Fear gives us a backwards mentality, forward mentality. Fear makes us look backwards. Fear makes us retreat. Fear makes us withdraw. But God says, I want you moving forward. I want you to step out in the promise I gave you. I want you to step out in because I said I'll be with you in the storms. I want you to step out in your parenting. I want you to step out in your career. I want you to step out in your calling. I want you to step out in my promise. I'm scared. I want it the way that it was. I want it the way that it's always been, because fear, I like to sit in my comfort bubble, wrapped up in bubble wrap. That's fear mentality. Faith mentality says, I'm going to step out in the calling God has for me. I'm going to step out in the promise that God has for me. And you want to talk about not making progress? Here's the rest of the story. Because fear, it led the nation of Israel to rebel against God and not step out in the promise that God gave them. And so everybody 40 and over never made it to the promised land. That group that rebelled against God, that sat in fear, they wandered around the same mountain for 40 years until Joshua let them in. They died in the wilderness. They had the promised land in front of them. They had the promise of God in front of them. And they died in the wilderness. You see, it didn't just stop their progress. It eventually led to their death. What are you afraid of today? I'm not talking about snakes. I'm not talking about heights. I'm not talking about clowns. Although valid. They're real fears. I'm not making fun of them. What are you afraid of in here? What's holding you back from the promise that God gave you? In your careers, in your family, in your relationships. Some of you in here today, you see these guys up on stage and you're like, man, I want to join a church, but you're afraid. You're afraid of what that expectation is. You got burned at some point in a church. Some of you are afraid to step out in a new relationship because you opened up your heart and you opened up your emotions and you opened up your family and you got burned. Some of you got burned by church. Some of you got burned by a relationship in church. Some of you got burned by a guy standing on the stage. I get it. But if you sit in fear, it's going to rob you of the purpose and the calling that God has for you to be a part of something bigger than yourself. We're going to baptize here in a minute, and if y'all hadn't made your way, go ahead and head that way. Some of you are scared to death to step forward and get baptized. Because then everybody's going to look at you, right? And there's going to be some new standard put on you, and you're afraid you're going to fail. You're afraid you're not going to live up in expectation. So rather than walk out in the obedience God modeled for us, you're going to sit back in fear. And it's going to hold you back from the calling and the influence that you could have. I want to encourage you, don't walk in fear. Don't look at it through fear. Look at it through faith. Faith-filled belief in a sovereign God will change your life dramatically. The last series, we talked about being radical, and we talked about sharing your story, and we talked about sharing your faith. And that scared some of you to death. You didn't do it because you're like, oh, what are they going to think about me? Or, oh, my coworkers, or, oh, my other students, they're going to make fun of me. And we walk in fear of what others think. Instead of living for an audience of one, we live for an audience of people. What are you afraid of? What's got you bound? What's got you stopped from moving forward into the promise that God gave you? See, here's the truth of it. God gave each and every one of you a promise and a future and a plan. What's holding you back from that? What's holding you back? Some of you haven't stepped out in following Christ because you're afraid. Does that mean I have to be weird? You were weird before you accepted Christ. Look around, you're in a room full of weird people. Well, what's the expectation? To take one step at a time. What's the expectation of my family? To take one step at a time in becoming the spiritual leader of your home. Dads, you're not a failure. God's promised. He'll be there for you through thick and thin. What's holding you back from the calling that God has on your life? Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at those. Fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of death, fear of all those. Today I want to look at the negative effects of fear because I want us to go out this week and be I can people. I can because God promised. Not I can't, but I can faith-filled followers of Christ. And if you're not a follower of Christ, I want to encourage you, take that step. It'll be the best step to life change you've ever had. Bow with me this morning. God, I just thank you. God, there's a lot to be afraid of. You turn on the news, wars, rumors of wars, famines, sickness, death. Here's the thing, God. You told us it was all going to happen. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Fear not. God, I pray in this room today that those sitting in here today that are bound by fear of something, whether it's family or relationships, that God, you will help them to become I can, faith-filled, sovereign God-following people, as opposed to enemy-led, fear-based life. God, you have that power. You have that control. God, I pray that we begin to trust you in everything